September 12th, 1941. Experimental Proving Grounds, Valcartier, Quebec, Canada. The air is cold and thin, carrying the damp scent of pine and gunpowder. Dr. George K. Ken Williams, Head of Explosives Research for the Canadian National Research Council, NRC, stands hunched behind a reinforced bunker, his face smudged with soot and fatigue. Next to him, a team of engineers nervously checks instruments. They are preparing for another test of the Great Canadian Hope, the long-range bombardment rocket. The promise was simple, the execution proving maddeningly complex. If Canada could perfect a stable, long-range rocket, it could provide the Allies with a cheap, devastating weapon capable of striking deep behind German lines, complementing the slow, expensive bomber forces. A long, cylindrical projectile, crude, bulky, and utterly unlike the sleek, future V-weapons being developed by the Germans, stands tethered on the launch rail. Its chamber is packed with a massive quantity of propellant, and the warhead is filled with the newest, most potent explosive compound Williams's team has managed to synthesize. Ignition sequence confirmed. A technician states flatly into the intercom. "Launch on my mark," Williams replies, his voice tight. This is the 14th major test in 3 months, and everyone has ended in failure. Mark. A ferocious, blinding jet of orange and white flame erupts from the rocket's base, followed by a roar that shakes the very ground beneath the bunker. For a fleeting second, the engineers feel hope. The rocket ascends, stable and true, punching through the clear morning sky. But then, 500 feet up, the nightmare sequence begins. The rocket yaws wildly, veering completely off its programmed trajectory. It begins to wobble, tumbling end over end as the aerodynamic stresses tear it apart. Finally, it crashes back down into the designated empty range, not with the clean bang of a planned detonation, but with a sickening, muffled thwump of bent metal and burning propellant. Another catastrophic flight failure. Williams rips off his goggles and throws them onto the floor. The guidance system is useless. The fuel mix is unstable. It's still disintegrating before apogee. This entire project is a failure. Gentlemen, the long-range rocket project was soon shelled. The Allied nations, including Canada, simply could not master the complex guidance and propulsion systems needed for accurate rocketry at that stage of the war. The immense resources poured into the project seemed wasted. Yet, unbeknownst to Williams and his frustrated team, one single critical element of their failed experiment was destined to become one of the most vital secret weapons of the entire war. That element wasn't the airframe or the engine. It was the explosive filler they had packed into the useless warhead. During the rocket program, Williams' chemists had been tasked with developing an explosive charge that would be far more powerful than the standard TNT, trinitrotoluene, currently used across Allied munitions. They needed maximum punch for minimum payload weight, a necessity for rocket warfare. The compound they perfected was known chemically as cyclotrimethylnitrinitramine. Due to the intense secrecy surrounding its development, the British and Canadian teams gave it the simple, code-driven name, RDX, Research Department Explosive. This RDX, synthesized and refined by Canadian chemists, was astonishing. Test after test confirmed its power. RDX was approximately 1.5 times more potent than TNT pound for pound. It delivered a faster shock wave, a hotter blast, and a vastly increased destructive radius. It was, quite simply, the most powerful and stable military explosive the Allies had ever possessed. The rocket had failed, but the powder inside it was a spectacular, accidental triumph. Now, the challenge shifted from putting the explosive into a rocket to figuring out how to weaponize this secret, ultra-powerful compound for the conventional war effort. The answer would eventually be found not in airframes, but in the relentless, terrifying chaos of the anti-submarine war. December 1942, the Shell Factory, Transcona, Manitoba, the Canadian prairies, far from the conflict, hummed with a different kind of war effort, the industrial, high-stakes process of munitions manufacturing. Here, in a massive, nondescript factory, the secret production of RDX was reaching industrial scale under suffocating security. The chemists had solved the problem of stability. The engineers now faced the challenge of integration. The new explosive, pure RDX, was too sensitive for direct use in most munitions. It required a special blend, often mixed with TNT and a stabilizing wax, a mixture known as Composition C, or more commonly, Torpex, torpedo explosive. Torpex had a relative effectiveness of about 1.6 times that of pure TNT. This was the powerhouse ingredient that would revolutionize British ordnance. Meanwhile, back in Britain, one of the war's most eccentric and brilliant minds, Dr. Barnes Wallis, was facing his own set of desperate engineering challenges. Wallis, the designer of the Wellington bomber, was now obsessed with a near-impossible task, destroying the heavily protected German dams that powered the Ruhr industrial heartland. Standard bombs were useless against the colossal concrete structures. Wallis's concept was audacious, bordering on the insane, a spinning barrel-shaped bomb that would skip across the water's surface like a stone, bypass the torpedo nets, and sink directly against the dam wall before detonating. The famous bouncing bomb, codenamed Upkeep. But even with perfect delivery, the challenge remained: how to pack enough destructive energy into the limited space of the barrel bomb to breach meters of solid concrete. TNT simply didn't have the necessary punch. Wallis, in a tense meeting at the Air Ministry's Directorate of Bomb Development, argued vehemently, "Gentlemen, the physical forces required to achieve a clean breach on the Möhne or Eder are immense. The payload must deliver maximum hydrostatic shock. We need an explosive of unprecedented power." An official from the Ministry of Supply leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Dr. Wallis, we have been running successful trials with a new filler, developed by our Canadian colleagues. We're calling it Torpex. It contains the RDX compound. It's stable, denser, and significantly more powerful than anything we are currently fielding. They are using it in depth charges with frightening results against U-boats." The decision was immediate and critical. The Upkeep bouncing bombs would not be filled with standard TNT. They would be packed almost entirely with Canadian-made Torpex, leveraging the RDX compound that had originated in the ashes of the failed rocket program. The sheer power required to collapse the dams would be delivered courtesy of a compound originally designed to be launched hundreds of miles by a device that couldn't fly 50. This seemingly unrelated development was RDX's first major field test. On the night of May 16, 1943, Operation Chastise, the Dam Busters raid, was executed. The Avro Lancasters of the legendary 617 Squadron, led by Wing Commander Guy Gibson, flew dangerously low across Europe. When the Upkeep bombs detonated against the dam walls, the resulting explosions, magnified by the underwater shockwave, were catastrophic. The Möhne and Eder dams were breached, not just by precision delivery, but by the enormous chemical energy released by the Torpex payload. The success of the raid confirmed RDX's transformative power in a spectacular way. The secret compound was no longer just an experimental chemical. It was a proven war winner. This success quickly accelerated its adoption into virtually every major Allied explosive device. But its most critical, life-saving role was yet to come, on the contested beaches of France. February 1944. Allied High Command Briefing Room, London. The atmosphere in the subterranean bunker was thick with cigarette smoke and mounting tension. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Europe, was looming. Maps detailing the German defenses along the Atlantic Wall stretched across the massive central table. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, ran a weary hand across his face as he absorbed the intelligence reports. The German response to the anticipated invasion was chillingly effective, particularly along the beaches designated for the assault: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had turned the low tide zones into killing fields. "Gentlemen," reported a grim-faced Royal Navy captain, pointing to aerial reconnaissance photographs of Normandy. "Rommel has deployed thousands of new, highly reinforced obstacles. We're talking steel hedgehogs, mined Belgian gates, and heavy, angled log ramps, all designed to tear the bottoms out of our landing craft and funnel our troops into concentrated machine gun fire." The critical problem was the high water mark. The landing craft, carrying the first waves of infantry and engineers, had only a few brief hours during the low tide to approach, land their troops, and clear enough of a lane before the tide rushed back in, leaving them stranded and vulnerable. Standard explosive charges, even the large TNT blocks used by the Royal Engineers, were proving frustratingly slow and inefficient against the sheer scale and hardened nature of the obstacles. The engineers, known as the beach clearance teams or assault engineers, would have to swim through freezing water under heavy fire, attach the charges, and retreat, all in a brutal race against the water and the clock. Using standard explosives meant they could only clear a handful of lanes before the tide returned, guaranteeing a massacre for the follow-on forces. "We need a faster rate of clearance," Eisenhower demanded, his voice low but firm. "We cannot afford to lose the landing windows. We need to blow these steel and timber obstructions in seconds, not minutes, and the resulting blast must be total." The solution had already been proven in the successful destruction of the German dams. RDX. By early 1944, the mass production of RDX, chiefly driven by the Canadian plants, which had scaled up the process perfected during the failed rocket experiments, meant the compound was finally available in the immense quantities required for an operation of this size. The engineers tasked with preparing the demolition charges quickly shifted their focus to the RDX-based explosives. The RDX, usually mixed into Composition B, an RDX TNT blend, was packed into specially designed, high-density demolition blocks. These charges were dramatically smaller and lighter than their TNT counterparts, yet delivered the required 150% boost in destructive power. This increase in efficiency was a game-changer. A single engineer could now carry the equivalent destructive power of 2 or 3 men using TNT. More crucially, the rapid, high-brisance shockwave delivered by the RDX-based charges guaranteed the instantaneous destruction of the hardened steel and wood obstacles, leaving clear, deep channels. The accidental success of the Canadian chemical program had delivered exactly what the frontline troops needed: speed and power. This explosive was the secret weapon delivered not by rocket, but by chemistry, a silent, potent insurance policy for the bloodiest day of the war. June 6, 1944. H hour minus 15 minutes. Omaha Beach. Sector Easy Red. The water is the color of cold steel. Corporal Thomas "Tommy" Jenkins of the 299th Engineer Combat Battalion shivers inside his wet diving suit, not entirely from the cold. The air above the churning waves is already thick with the smell of cordite and the relentless, screaming whine of German 88mm shells. The first wave of landing craft, LCVPs packed with desperate infantry, is heading toward the murderous shoreline. Jenkins and his small team of demolition specialists are moments away from their most critical mission. They are not here to fight. They are here to clear. Their objective: blow a sufficient number of 12-foot-wide lanes through the dense thicket of obstacles Rommel had planted between the low and high water marks. 30 seconds to drop. "Tommy," Lieutenant Harrison yells over the roar of the surf and the boats. Jenkins checks the satchel slung across his chest. It contains the Composition B charges, the RDX-based plastic explosive blocks, wrapped in waterproof canvas. They are heavy, but dramatically more potent than the older TNT blocks he trained with. This is their advantage: the power to destroy the massive Belgian gates and the steel check hedgehogs with a single, quick placement. As the ramp drops, Jenkins plunges into the frigid sea, immediately taking cover behind the nearest line of submerged obstacles. The sound of machine gun fire is deafening. The air is alive with tracers. The regular infantry is already taking horrific losses. The success of the invasion now rests heavily on the engineers' ability to quickly clear the path for the heavier equipment and subsequent waves. The obstacles must be cleared before the tide completely covers them, rendering them invisible and therefore catastrophic to the landing craft due in the next hour. It is a desperate race. Jenkins swims to a gigantic Belgian gate, a steel framework meant to rip the bottom out of any vessel. He knows that with the old TNT charges, he would need 2 large blocks, carefully placed, and a minute-long fuse. But thanks to the failed Canadian rocket program, he has the supercharge. He swiftly applies a single, thick, custom-shaped block of Composition B, the RDX filler making it instantly effective. He shoves a short, specialized non-L detonator into the plastic putty, twists the fuse cap, and pulls the firing wire. "Fire in the hole," he yells, purely for his own benefit, as the ambient noise drowns out everything. He kicks backward and counts 5. Caracom. The resulting explosion is not the rolling thump of TNT. It is a sharp, instantaneous, blinding flash, followed by a devastating, high-brisance shock wave. The heavy steel Belgian gate is not merely moved, it is vaporized. Pieces of jagged metal fly high into the air, and a clean, deep channel of disturbed water marks the spot. One obstacle, one placement, one short fuse. Fast, Jenkins repeats the process, moving methodically, relying on the incredible efficiency of the RDX payload. The engineers, working desperately under intense fire, managed to clear 10 times the lanes they would have with standard explosives. Every single successful detonation, powered by the accidental Canadian chemical breakthrough, meant one more clear path, saving untold numbers of lives and allowing vital tank support to reach the pinned-down infantry. As the first LCT, landing craft tank, lumbers past the explosion zone, utilizing the newly cleared lane. Jenkins looks back at the beach. It is chaos, but it is not a total rout. The foothold is secure, barely. The power of a failed rocket had successfully demolished Hitler's Atlantic Wall defenses right where it mattered most. Late June 1944, Royal Engineers Depot, Southampton, England. Back from the maelstrom of the invasion, Corporal Jenkins is exhausted, but alive. He sits with Lieutenant Harrison, meticulously cleaning the tools of his trade, the detonators, the crimpers, and the canvas satchels that carried their powerful cargo. News of the immense logistical success, coupled with the horrific casualties, filters through the camp. The beaches had been secured, the momentum of the invasion held, and the lanes cleared by the engineers proved critical. "We lost half the team on Omaha." "Lieutenant," Jenkins mutters, scrubbing soot off a waterproof primer cap, "but we got the lanes open. The tanks got ashore faster than expected. Why were those charges so damn effective, sir? They packed a hell of a punch for their size." Harrison nods, his expression somber. "It was the filler, Corporal, the Composition B. You were essentially carrying a chemical accident in your kit. It wasn't the standard high explosive. It was RDX." He pauses, leaning closer to Jenkins, the necessity of secrecy still ingrained. The chemists in Canada. They were trying to build a long-range rocket, a terrible failure called the Arrow. They spent millions and wasted years trying to put a warhead hundreds of miles away, but the warhead itself was the triumph. They perfected the mass production of a compound called RDX. Harrison takes a breath, looking at the distant sound of an aircraft taking off. Think of it. The enemy spent years perfecting their V-rockets to strike London. We, on the other hand, stumbled onto the perfect demolition charge because we couldn't even get our own rocket off the ground reliably. The failure of that distant Canadian lab gave us the power to shatter Rommel's defenses on D-Day. The adoption of RDX, stemming from that initial, flawed Canadian program, fundamentally changed the nature of Allied explosive ordnance. It became the backbone of Torpex, which broke the German dams and decimated U-boats. It saturated the warheads of rockets like the Hedgehog anti-submarine projector, finally turning the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. And most crucially, it was the explosive that allowed the assault engineers to clear the beaches of Normandy with life-saving speed and efficiency. Historians would later calculate that without the rapid, powerful clearance provided by RDX-filled demolition charges on the beaches of Normandy, particularly the killing grounds of Omaha and Juno, the initial waves of the invasion would have likely stalled, resulting in a disastrous failure and exponentially higher casualties. The accidental potency of a failed rocket became the chemical key that unlocked the Atlantic War, ultimately saving thousands of Allied lives. The long-range bombardment rocket, Canada's great hope, was forgotten, relegated to a footnote in the history of Allied research failures. Its true legacy, however, was written not in the sky, but on the heavily fortified sands of France, measured not in miles of flight, but in acres of cleared beachhead and the silent, profound relief of the men who survived a shower. It was a potent reminder that in the chaotic crucible of war, sometimes the most critical breakthroughs are found not in success, but in the unexpected value hidden within catastrophic failure.